Okay, so today we're talking about changing the subject of formulas. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is what a formula is. Basically, a formula is an equation that has more than one variable in it. And so, for instance, I might write m equals 8h plus 50. And so this might represent that I have $50 in the bank, and I earn $8 for every hour that I work, and that gives me some total amount of money. And so in this example of a formula, there's an input and an output. I'd like you to, in a second, pause the video and decide which variable you think is the input and which variable you think is the output. Okay, pause the video now. All right, so in this example, h is the input and m is the output because we must know what h is before we can determine how much money we have. How many hours we worked changes how much money we have. And so I might say, for instance, the amount of money we have is equal to 8 times 2 plus 50, where we work 2 hours, and so that would be 50 plus 16, so that would be $66. That's what m is. Now, I might also say, well, I have $66. How many hours did I work? Well, as you know, it's 2. We just worked that out. But for instance, I might put the 66 in here and say that equals 8h plus 50, and now it's your job to solve for h. And so we've done that where we say what's happening to h, and we undo it by using PEMDAS backwards. The problem with this is that with computers today, the software that's on your computers is written by using a formula, and so that's a big use of formula. The computer doesn't know how to solve equations. That's what we're for. What the computer needs is it needs a formula like this, so it can just plug in values and get an answer. It's the same thing as anytime you do work like this, you would rather not have to solve every problem individually. You would rather have probably a formula where you plug in input, and then you can just use a calculator to find the output. And so, as opposed to doing that and solving every equation possible, what we're going to do is rearrange this so that h is the output and m is the input. That means that we need h all by itself on one side of the equation. We're going to do this the same way that we solved for h when we knew what m was. And so I'm still going to ask the question, what's happening to h? Because I would like to solve for h. Well, h is being multiplied by an 8 and added by a 50. And so I'm going to use PEMDAS backwards to undo those. And so there's no subtraction. We can give it a check mark. There is addition, so we have to undo the addition first. So we're going to subtract 50 from each side. Our result of that is that we have 8h on the right, and on the left side we have m minus 50. Now I don't know how to subtract 50 from m because m is a variable, and so I'm just going to write m minus 50. Okay, and so the next step, we say what's happening to h? I'm sorry, that was addition, so that's done. Well, there's no division happening, so we can check that off. H is being multiplied by 8, and so we have to undo that next. And so we do that by dividing each side by 8. And that turns into a 1. And so 1h is just h. And then we have on this side, again, I can't divide by 8 because I don't know what m is, and so I'm just going to write the same as I had in the previous step. And there are no exponents or parentheses, and so we're finished. And so if I'd like to rewrite this the other direction, I can write h equals m minus 50 over 8. And now I've changed the subject from m, all by itself on the left side, to h, all by itself on the left side. Now I could go ahead and plug in a value for m, how much money I have, and by evaluating the right side, I can now find out how many hours it took me to earn that. Okay, now we're going to work on 2 examples of this, and so the first example is in the area of a rectangle. And so we would say that the area of a rectangle is equal to length times width. And so I write my L like that so that it doesn't look like a number 1. And so now I would say, if I want to change the subject from area to length, how would I do that? So pause the video and take a minute to determine what steps you would take to change the subject from area to length. Okay, so the first step would be to ask what's happening to length, because that's what I want to get by itself. That's what I want my subject to be. And so I would say, well, length is being multiplied by w. And so there's no subtraction, no addition, no division. It's being multiplied. And so I would undo the multiplication by dividing. And in this case, length is being multiplied by w, so I would divide by w. and I have to do that on each side. And so keeping my equal signs lined up, w divided by w, no matter what w is, any number divided by itself is 1. So I have 1L, or just L. And so L is equal to area divided by width. And so now if I were to give you two values for area and width, you could plug those in and evaluate for L. Okay, so I've erased the board, and there's one more example that I want to work through with you. And so in this example, if y equals x divided by r minus z. And so I want you to change the subject from y to x. So pause the video now and see if you can do the first step. Okay, so the first step would be to say, well, what's happening to x, since that's what I want to use as my subject? Well, it's being divided by r, and it's being subtracted by z. And so I've got to use PEMDAS backwards, so I would suggest writing PEMDAS down and starting at the bottom and saying, well, is it being subtracted? Yes, it is, and so we need to undo that first. So pause the video and see if you can do that first step by undoing the subtraction. Okay, so to undo the subtraction, we would have to do addition, and so we would add z to each side. Now what that leaves us with is on the right side here, negative z plus z makes 0, and then all that's remaining is x over r. Now on the left side we have y plus z, and I don't know how to do that, so I'm just going to write y plus z. Okay, so now pause the video and see if you can do the next step. Okay, so the next step would be to say, well, we've done S in PEMDAS. Is there any addition happening? No. Is there any division happening? Yes, there is. X is being divided by R. So we say, okay, so how do we undo that? So we would have to multiply on each side by R. So we multiply by R. Now on this side, we're multiplying the whole side by R. And so what we need to do is put this in parentheses and then put an R, and I'm out of space, on the side. Because we're not just multiplying y by r or z by r, we're multiplying everything on the left side of the equal sign by r, and so it needs to go into parentheses. And so now pause the video and see if you can figure out what the result of that step would be. Okay, so the result of that step would be that r over r makes 1, and 1x is just written x. And now on this step, I would actually go ahead and distribute this r. And so we would have r times y plus r times z equals x. And that would be the answer, because now x is all alone on one side of the equation, so x is the subject of this formula. Okay, and that's it for this lesson.